Our story begins with a young man who, after graduating, took out a loan to build the village's only pumping station. For 8 years, he only charged the basic electricity rate so the neighbors' orchards wouldn't wither away during the dry season. But his greedy uncle and a local agricultural firm decided to report him. They falsely accused him of stealing electricity and wasting water, eventually forcing him to hand over the management. In the year 2000, he signed a liability waiver, removed his own central motor, and set off to see a friend about building a fully automated organic farm right in the middle of a drought. When the villagers saw the astronomical bills and their fruit trees dying on the mountainside, they grabbed his uncle and shoved our protagonist down into the mud. Just moments before that chaos, he had been busy cleaning the water pump's filter. His uncle, Ian, walked into the pump room accompanied by a stranger carrying official documents and a piece of candy. As soon as he stepped inside, Ian's face twisted into a deep, disapproving frown. He complained about the noise and asked Ethan just how old this ancient pump was supposed to be. To Ian, it seemed incredibly inefficient, with water trickling out as weak as a child's stream. He even accused Ethan of restricting the water on purpose. Aunt Wendy had just arrived with her empty bucket, and upon hearing this, she dropped her carrying pole to the ground in frustration. We have to remember the village is on high ground. The fact that this pump works at all is a miracle. For 8 long years, Ethan had only ever charged them for the basic electricity costs. He asked for patience as he opened the gate, but his uncle told him to save the fairy tales. Ian scoffed at the idea of a basic fee, claiming he had paid $60 just the previous month. He went as far as to accuse Ethan of tampering with the system or stealing water to sell to the next town. Ethan explained that since their orchard was on the highest peak, pumping water up there required a massive amount of electricity. The account books were right there, posted on the wall for everyone to see. He told them to look for themselves, as he couldn't make sense of their false accusations. Ian simply ignored him, insisting that Ethan had been swindling the villagers out of their hard-earned money. He then called for everyone's attention, introducing a man named Mr. Miller from the Green Garden Agricultural Company. Ian claimed that if they handed over this old pump to Mr. Miller's company for management, they would immediately receive a free upgrade to a modern irrigation system. The representative, Mr. Miller, stepped forward to address the crowd. He cleared his throat and explained that modern agriculture was all about precision drip irrigation. In his view, this antiquated equipment should have been replaced a long time ago. He promised that if they handed it over, the company would replace everything for free. They would even be able to pay for their water right from their mobile phones at home. Aunt Wendy, who used to smile at Ethan, blinked in surprise the moment she heard the word free. The other villagers began to murmur among themselves, thinking a free upgrade sounded like a wonderful idea. They complained that Ethan's pump was far too old and occasionally caused power outages in the area. They figured Ian had seen the world and surely wanted the best for the village. He wouldn't deceive them. Ethan looked at those familiar faces, the same neighbors he had helped by repairing power lines in the pouring rain. At midnight, just to save their fruit trees, he watched as their expressions shifted from doubt to eager expectation, noticing that even their glances toward him now held a hint of suspicion and disdain. The hand holding the key slowly grew cold as he realized where things were heading. The next day, before the sun had even risen, the village loudspeaker began to blare. His uncle, Mr. Kong, spoke with a heavy seriousness, calling every villager to an emergency assembly. The agenda was simple: remove Ethan from his position and welcome the era of modernization. By the time he arrived at the meeting grounds, we see the courtyard was already packed with people. Standing on the steps with a stack of printed documents, his uncle addressed the crowd. He claimed water was the village's lifeblood, and they couldn't let Ethan keep control of it. The village chief approached with his hands behind his back, telling Ethan to look around. He told him this was the will of the people, and that the time for modernization had finally come. It was about agricultural progress, he insisted, and Ethan needed to think of the greater good. Furthermore, his uncle warned that the Green Garden Company wouldn't start work unless Ethan surrendered the key. They apparently feared he might sabotage them, which, to be honest, was a bit of a stretch. Ethan reminded the chief that for 8 years, he had paid for every replacement part out of his own pocket. Whenever the pipes leaked in the dead of winter, he was the one diving into the freezing water to fix them. He hadn't received a single cent in subsidies from the village for all that backbreaking work, and now they wanted to throw him out? The chief simply replied that times change. He argued that a large corporation had technology that Ethan simply couldn't compete with. Why keep killing himself with all that manual labor? He told Ethan not to worry about it. He urged him not to be stubborn, while Ethan looked out at the hundreds of people in the courtyard. Not a single person stepped forward to say a word in his defense. Not even Aunt Mary, who had just been praising him yesterday for repairing the pump, would meet his gaze. In that moment, any remaining loyalty he felt for this place completely vanished. He pulled a document from his pocket that he had drafted the night before, a formal resignation and division of assets. Without a word, he placed it firmly on the village chief's table for everyone to see. If they wanted him to hand over control so badly, he decided he would give them exactly what they asked for. Since they all chose to believe he was corrupt and that the corporation was their savior, he would step aside. He told them to sign and leave their thumbprints, declaring that from this day on, the water supply was no longer his concern. Ethan made it clear, from this point forward, whether they faced drought or flood, life or death, he was out. He told them they would each have to face their own destiny. The villagers looked at the paper, momentarily stunned. His uncle was the first to snap, claiming the village wouldn't fall apart just because Ethan was gone. He didn't hesitate to be the first one to press his thumb into the red ink and sign the paper. Then came his second cousin, then Aunt Mary. The entire village began to line up one by one. They were all terrified that a simple delay might cost them their precious free high-tech upgrade. They signed with an almost frantic enthusiasm, and as Ethan watched the pages fill with red marks, the heavy weight he had been carrying in his heart for years suddenly shattered, replaced by a sense of total relief. He tucked the signed agreement away, turned his back on the crowd, and walked toward the pump house. His uncle and a group of villagers followed close behind him, watching him as if he were a common thief. He unlocked the door, grabbed a heavy wrench, and headed straight for the back of the machinery room. Under the stunned gaze of the crowd, he began to dismantle the high-pressure pulse generator. It was the single most critical component of the old pump, and it belonged entirely to him. There was a specific motor that still had the power to pump water all the way up to the back mountain. It was his own private property, purchased at a steep price through some well-placed contacts. The villagers, however, had always dismissed it as nothing more than a piece of junk. His second cousin, seeing him approach it, let out an alarmed shout for everyone to watch out. He claimed Ethan was going to sabotage the system and yelled for the others to stop him. He warned them not to let Ethan take what he called the collective property of the village. And so, several villagers rushed forward to block the door, convinced they were protecting their own. Ethan simply smiled sarcastically and pulled the original bill of sale for the motor from his backpack. He held it up alongside the liability waiver they had all just finished signing. He told them to open their eyes and look closely at the proof of who actually owned the machine. The receipt clearly showed he had paid 80,000 credits of his own money for it. The agreement also explicitly stated that he was entitled to take all of his personal belongings with him. He pointed out that he hadn't touched a single screw of the pump room or the pipes they wanted so badly. A heavy silence fell over the room as his uncle's face turned a sickly shade of pale. Looking at the black ink on the official document, the old man found he couldn't utter a single word. By the time Ethan finished dismantling the grease-covered motor from its base, he was drenched in sweat. While the machine looked battered and peeling on the outside, those who truly understand machinery knew better. It was a high-power industrial motor built with first-generation pure copper coils, a rare find indeed. To get water from the ravine to the highest orchard in the village, he had worked tirelessly. He had spent weeks scouring used equipment markets across 3 different cities to find this exact piece. He had spent exactly 80,000 credits to bring it here and keep it running over the last 8 years. No matter how unstable the voltage became or how long it had to pump water, this old motor had never once failed him. However, weighing over 400 pounds, he couldn't lift it alone and had to slide it across wooden planks toward the truck bed. The rough hemp rope sliced into his palms, and the stinging sweat began to blur his vision. Instinctively, he looked toward the gate, and there, in the empty lot by the entrance, we see dozens of villagers from his own town gathered together. There was Aunt Jane, Uncle Bill, and all those familiar faces he had once helped so willingly, often spending his own midnight hours repairing their irrigation pipes for free. They all stood in the shade of the old locust tree, yet not a single person stepped forward to help, nor did they offer even a polite word of farewell. Instead, they covered their noses as if they feared the smell of grease on his body might stain them. Their eyes filled with a mixture of undisguised contempt and suspicion. At that moment, his cousin Isaac raised his phone and began filming him without stopping. Isaac mocked him, telling Ethan to be careful not to throw out his back with that piece of junk. He shouted for everyone to look at the man who used to be the village's so-called water king. He claimed Ethan had deceived them for 8 years with nothing but a scrap industrial motor. He complained that everything reeked of used oil and questioned if the water from such a machine could ever be good for their orchards. He even blamed the poor fruit sales of recent years on this very pump. He insisted the root of all their problems was right here, and the crowd began to agree with him. He claimed the water was surely full of heavy metals and that it was high time for a change. Even the noise of that old machine bothered him, apparently keeping him from his afternoon naps. He told Ethan to take it away quickly, as just looking at it was a nuisance. Then, Uncle Ian appeared, standing with his hands tucked behind his back. Like a general who had just won a great battle, he stepped out from the crowd. He had even put on brand new clothes today specifically for the occasion. His pockets were bulging, and one could just make out the outlines of several cigarette packs. This was his reward, a bribe from the massive Lu Yuan Agricultural Corporation. They had just handed it over as payment for his recent promotional efforts. He told Isaac to stop filming, acting as if he were the voice of reason. He sighed, telling Ethan to just leave quickly and be done with it. He claimed he wasn't criticizing, but that Ethan was simply too stubborn to move with the times. The Lu Yuan company was bringing in high-tech, intelligent equipment from the city tomorrow, featuring pumps made entirely of high-grade stainless steel. It supposedly came with deep, multi-layer filtration systems. The new water would not only be cleaner than anything that old machine could produce, but because they were a large corporation, the water rates would be cut in half. It would be even cheaper than Ethan's supposed cost price. He then turned to the neighbors. He promised that from now on, the village water would meet the same standards as bottled water in the city. No one would ever have to come out at midnight again just to watch over a switch. Ian explains that everything is controlled with a single click on a mobile phone for automatic irrigation. What do we call this? He asks. This is what we call smart, internet-based agriculture. We see the villagers listening intently, convinced their town is about to strike it rich. They grin from ear to ear, already imagining their autumn orchards heavy with fruit. To them, those fruits look like solid gold. An impatient young man even spits near Ethan's truck, telling him to hurry up and leave so he doesn't block the corporation's construction vehicles. Ethan simply wipes the rust from his hands, looking at these people who think they're so clever. Deep down, his heart has turned completely cold toward them. He reminds them that the liability waiver is signed and filed with the village committee. From this moment on, whether they get rich or lose everything is no longer his concern. He drops those words coldly, steps into his truck, and shuts the door. He floors the accelerator, leaving behind the mocking laughter of his uncle and the neighbors. After leaving that forgotten valley, Ethan drives straight to the home of an old, trusted friend. He knows that while others see his old industrial motor as mere scrap metal, it's a different story when it's in the hands of someone who actually understands farming. In the right hands, it is a tool that can quite literally save lives. He spends 3 days scouting the area until he finally finds a massive, empty wasteland. It's a vast stretch of land, covering roughly 16 or 17 acres. The rent for this particular plot is incredibly cheap, and for one very good reason. You see, the water table here is buried far too deep for normal wells. Standard domestic agricultural water pumps simply aren't up to the task here. They can't draw water at all, and even if they manage a trickle, the amount is miserable. It wouldn't even be enough to irrigate a fraction of this massive plot. Everyone who tried to lease this land before failed because they couldn't solve the water problem. They lost every cent of their capital and left with their tails between their legs. But Ethan isn't worried. The first thing he does after leasing the land is hire a professional team to drill a deep well. Then, he firmly mounts that grease-covered, traditional old motor onto the base. The very moment he flips the switch, the engine lets out a loud, deep roar, sounding like a beast that has just woken up. Suddenly, a jet of water as thick as a man's arm erupts violently from dozens of meters underground. With enough water, he knows the rest will be easy. He leans on his 8 years of farming experience, which helps him get the job done right. With this high-powered irrigation, he begins planting high-value organic cherries in this cheap red soil, along with premium seedless grapes. His life begins to move as if he had pressed the fast-forward button, heading day by day toward what looks to be a magnificent harvest. Meanwhile, back in the village, they are submerged in a false bustle of modernization. The Liyuan company arrived with a very pretty-looking new pump, complete with a shiny stainless steel casing and covered in colorful high-tech stickers. To top it all off, it even came with a large, fancy touchscreen. And, of course, it boasted the immense power of modern technology, featuring a tactile LCD screen that looked 100 times better than Ethan's old motor. Our story's uncle, being the one who brought in the investment, suddenly became the most popular man in the entire village. The Liyuan company went out of its way to secure his support as the local authority, ensuring everything went their way. They didn't just give him a handsome commission, they also awarded him the contracts for the small pipeline construction projects throughout the village. Back then, the uncle was truly in his prime, basking in the glow of his newfound importance. Every day he paraded through the village with his little project folder, putting on the airs of a major contractor. He walked tall, fueled by the money obtained from selling off the village's very source of life. He bought a massive quantity of red bricks and cement and began managing the construction of his own monument. In the most visible spot in the center of town, he started building a 3-story house with a grand terrace. The villagers, with hose over their shoulders, looked on with hope at the new black plastic pipes being laid in the fields. However, when they squeezed them by hand, the reality was a bit different than the promise. The pipes felt soft, and the walls were as thin as a sheet of paper, hardly the stuff of legends. But in the uncle's mouth, this was rebranded as aerospace-grade polymer material, which sounds much more impressive, doesn't it? Everyone dreamed of getting rich, thinking that without any further worries, they could finally move up in the world. They believed they would enjoy cheap, clean water just like the people in the big cities do. But they didn't know that in the hands of fate, things that seem free have often already hidden their true price. The dream shattered during the very first month when it came time to actually pay for the water. It was late May, the critical time when the fruit trees are blooming and the harvest is beginning to set. The demand for water was growing more and more intense with each passing day. The Liyuan company's debt collector set up a table and sat with complete audacity right in the village committee's courtyard. And right next to him, he placed a sign with a QR code for payments, a modern touch for our villagers to admire. He announced that everyone should come to the committee to pay this month's bill and activate their smart IC cards. To ensure her irrigation wasn't interrupted, Aunt Wendy was among the very first to arrive. She held a few crumpled bills tightly in her hand as she approached the table. Her face still wore the cheerful smile of someone who believes they've found a bargain as she addressed the young man. She explained that for her small hillside plot, she only managed a couple of acres. Back when Ethan was in charge, she remembered that her monthly costs were quite manageable. In those days, she usually paid about $12 or $13 for the electricity to run the pump. She mentioned how her brother, the uncle, had promised this quality water would be half the price of the old way. She offered $10, innocently asking if that would be enough to cover her for the entire month. The collector was a young man with dyed yellow hair who didn't seem particularly interested in small talk. Without even looking up, he continued chewing his gum and took Aunt Wendy's card from her hand. He swiped it through the machine, which responded with a sharp, clinical beep. After tapping a few keys, the machine began to spit out a receipt that seemed over 3 feet long. He confirmed her name was Wendy and handed over the bill with total indifference. The total for the month came to $248, quite a leap from 10. He asked if she was paying with the code or cash, warning her that if the balance wasn't settled, the water would be cut off by tomorrow. Aunt Wendy's smile froze on her face instantly. The few bills she was holding nearly slipped from her fingers and fell to the dusty ground. Thinking she must have misheard him, her legs went weak and she nearly stumbled right then and there. She stammered in disbelief, asking if he had really said over $240. She suggested that perhaps the young man had simply misplaced a decimal point by mistake. She accused them of robbery, unable to fathom paying hundreds for such a tiny plot of land. Aunt Wendy's shout echoed through the air, leaving the rest of the waiting villagers completely stunned. The young man with the yellow hair simply rolled his eyes in response to her outburst. With an impatient sigh, he used his pen to point at the receipt, which was cluttered with various charges. He told her that even if she couldn't read, she still needed to be reasonable about the situation. He insisted it was all there in black and white, directing her attention to the very first line. The basic water rate was actually quite cheap, only about 15 cents per ton. That was much lower than what Ethan used to charge her, or so he claimed anyway. But this was a modern smart network, and we see that one doesn't just pay for the water itself. The second item was a monthly service fee for the smart platform, totaling $30. Then came the third item, $80 a month for pipe depreciation and daily maintenance costs. Fourth, since the village sits on a mountain, there was a shared cost for tiered pumping electricity. On top of that, there were rental fees for the smart meter and even a charge for adding trace elements. When everything was added up, that was the price, and that was supposedly with a company subsidy. The villagers began to whisper that Wendy should never have signed that contract with her thumbprint. They warned her not to swipe the card, but the collector snapped that the tap was on their own land. He coldly pointed out that no one had forced them to use it, a statement of pure, calculated absurdity. Aunt Wendy stood there trembling, wondering how a simple blessing of water had turned into such a burden. The news of what had happened to her spread through the village as if it had grown wings of its own. Everyone was absolutely stunned, remembering how things used to be when Ethan was still in charge. Back then, he had bought the motor himself and repaired the pipes personally, only ever charging for the basics. He had billed the pumping electricity at the exact state grid rate, without adding a single cent for himself. But now the Lu Yuan company had arrived, and things were handled quite differently. They applied the favorite method of big business, itemized fees and hidden surcharges at every turn. They were packing the bill with all sorts of invented service charges that no one had ever heard of before. In the end, for the exact same plot of land they had always farmed, the total cost had multiplied dozens of times over, a truly staggering increase. The village reached a breaking point, and we see that every single resident was now completely furious. These were women who would normally haggle for half an hour at the market over a few cents for vegetables. Now, their hearts were practically bleeding with rage at such a blatant injustice. Hundreds of people swarmed into the center of the village, their voices rising in a collective roar. They surrounded the 3-story house that was still being built for Uncle Ian. They screamed for the coward to come out, reminding him he had promised the water would be half the price. They accused him of using the money from the land sales to build himself a grand mansion. The crowd demanded to know if he was collaborating with the company to scam his own neighbors. At that very moment, Uncle Ian was up on the second floor, admiring his new, spacious terrace. Seeing the angry mob gathered below, he quickly straightened his clothes to look presentable. He walked out with an air of self-importance, though deep down, he felt a sudden wave of insecurity. The truth was, he had only just learned about the company's actual rates himself, but he had already pocketed a $50,000 bribe. Yes, naturally. So he had no choice but to keep lying with absolute, shameless confidence. He asked them what all the fuss was about, calling them short-sighted for complaining. He reminded them that this was a major provincial corporation with a reputation to uphold. He argued that a company of that scale obviously needed to recover its initial costs. He told them they were focusing far too much on the water bill right in front of them. They needed to think bigger, he claimed, insisting their water was packed with special nutrients. According to him, the water had undergone a process of high-tech filtration. He called it an investment, suggesting that spending a few hundred more now was wise. He promised that by autumn, their fruit would be so large and shiny that big city supermarkets would pay them $3 or $5 more per pound for the harvest. Those small water fees would be recovered 10 times over, or so he claimed. He warned that if they were too stingy to pay, their fruit would end up the size of a walnut, and they would only have their own narrow-mindedness to blame. The villagers were momentarily intimidated by this speech, which was a masterful blend of half-truths. Deep down, it hurt them deeply, but looking at the pipes already installed, they felt trapped. After all, the old pump had been removed and the well sealed by the Lu Yuan Company. There was no remedy. They simply had to grit their teeth and swallow the bitter pill. To save money, the villagers began to ration their water, turning deep irrigation into a trickle. They only dared to open the valves for 10 minutes to dampen the soil before pulling their cards. Where they used to pay every 10 days, they now stretched it to 15 or even 20. But fruit trees do not lie. Without enough water, the leaves that should have been lush began to yellow and wither, and the tender young fruit stopped growing once it reached the size of a small coin. The entire village was soon smothered in an atmosphere of oppression and anxiety. They could only pray in silence for heavy rains to save them from that cursed and expensive water bill. They had no way of knowing that the heavens have no mercy, and an abnormal weather pattern was about to bring the village to ruin with a century-level drought. In mid-July, it arrived. An unprecedented summer drought took hold, and for 45 whole days, not a single drop of rain fell. The village stream, where they once washed their clothes, had already completely dried up too. Weeks prior, leaving only a cracked bed where even the eels had turned into dried-out husks. In any other year, this would be the critical period for the fruit trees to set their crop. They couldn't go a day without water, yet this year, due to the predatory rates of the Lu Yuan Company, not a single villager dared to irrigate freely. The first to suffer was Aunt Annie, who had her land halfway up the slope. Her 2 acres of apple trees supported her entire family. But now the leaves were yellow and curling at the edges. If you touched them, they simply crumbled into dust. The green fruit, which should have been the size of a walnut, was wrinkled like old bark clinging to a stone. With just a slight brush, they fell and scattered. Aunt Annie collapsed onto the scorching earth, clutching her knees and bursting into loud sobs, crying out that everything was over and begging the heavens for help. She cried out that this money was meant for her husband's dialysis in the second half of the year, and for her grandson's middle school tuition in town this autumn. To buy fertilizer, she still owed $20,000 to the bank. If she didn't irrigate and these trees died of thirst, her entire family would have nothing left. Aunt Annie's weeping was like a signal, completely shattering the psychological defenses of the entire village. Someone shouted from the village entrance, declaring they couldn't take it anymore. Even if the water bills ruined them, they had to save the trees. First, hundreds of families ran like mad toward their own orchards, their eyes bloodshot with desperation. Regardless of the cost, they pulled out those smart cards they once considered a symbol of high technology, and with trembling hands, they swiped them through the readers. The sound of cards clicking echoed incessantly across the parched hills as hundreds of valves were simultaneously cranked to the maximum by the desperate villagers. Everyone watched, the black plastic pipes in the dirt, waiting for that expensive, nutrient-rich water to flow. But from the pipes, only a few dull thuds of trapped air emerged. Immediately after, the valve mouth spat out 2 jets of yellow, sandy water and then went completely. Still, not a single drop of water would come out. They wondered what had happened to the supply. One man had just loaded $850 onto his card, money meant for food, only to find the system provided by the Lu Yuan Company was failing them when they needed it most. The situation was becoming dire as the machinery remained silent. The villagers stood in shock, their hope for survival fading as the technology proved useless. And so, the silence over the dry fields became truly deafening. We see the machinery struggling under the immense pressure of the moment. The body of the machine was so incredibly hot that a wave of heat hit anyone who dared to get close. Back when Alex was in charge, the village used a pure copper industrial motor, a machine with enough power and torque that even if the entire village opened their valves at once to irrigate hundreds of acres, it could steadily pump deep groundwater all the way to the hilltop. But the Lu Yuan Company, in their infinite wisdom to cut costs and squeeze out profits, had brought in this so-called high-tech pump. In reality, it was nothing more than a low-quality, assembled mess, with a power rating that was, to be perfectly honest, gravely overestimated. Normally, when only a dozen households took turns irrigating, it could barely manage to scrape by. But now, with hundreds of valves suddenly thrown open, the pressure in the pipe network spiked instantly. This cheap pump was now forced to operate under an extreme and dangerous overload. Someone screamed to shut off the main switch and cut the power immediately. They knew it was going to explode, but as it turned out, it was already far too late. A dull, violent explosion echoed from deep within the pump room. Then, a series of blinding blue electrical sparks erupted from the thick, black smoke. That high-end pump that Uncle Ian had praised to the high heavens was now completely destroyed, and with it, the hopes of hundreds of village families were shattered. The following morning arrived far too early for those who hadn't slept. Very early the next day, the regional manager of the Lu Yuan Company, a man named Mr. Wallace, arrived slowly at the village in a brand-new black sedan. He simply kicked the remains of the pump, now nothing more than scrap metal, with his polished leather shoes. Uncle Ian rushed over as if he were greeting his own father, practically bowing before Mr. Wallace. He desperately explained that trouble had arrived, as the machine had suddenly exploded the previous day. He insisted that they couldn't be left without water, urging the manager to look at the damage. With the drought worsening, he knew the fruit trees simply couldn't wait any longer. He begged the company to send a team of engineers and a new machine to replace the broken one. Replace the machine? Mr. Wallace asked if Ian had lost his mind entirely. He told them to read the manual, claiming they had been warned 1,000 times when they received their cards. This precision equipment, he argued, was never meant to operate under such a simultaneous overload. He called it an illegal operation, labeling the incident as malicious damage caused by the users themselves. They had destroyed a high-tech smart device worth over 100,000, and now they expected the company to replace it for free. He asked them, quite mockingly, if they thought this was a charity. Upon hearing this, the villagers erupted in anger, refusing to accept the blame for the breakdown. In this drought, everyone needed to irrigate. The old machine handled hundreds of families at once without ever breaking. It was clear to them that this new machine was cheap and fake. After all, they paid a fortune for maintenance. Yet now that the pump was broken, the company refused to repair it. Mr. Wallace told them to shut up, suggesting that if they wanted to talk about the law, they should follow the contract. Since the equipment was destroyed by their own illegal operation, he laid out his terms for the return of the water. First, the entire village would have to pay compensation for the destroyed pump, plus the cost of purchasing and installing a new one, 30,000 in total. Second, to prevent this from happening again, to prevent further sabotage and losses to the company, the estimated water rates for the second half of the year, along with website maintenance and online platform service fees totaling 20,000, would be added to the bill. In total, 50,000 had to be paid up front and in a single installment directly into the company's account. Only after an official bank transfer for the full amount was received would the pump be replaced. He warned that if they were short even a penny, they could watch their mountain fruit trees turn into firewood. 50,000. That astronomical figure hung over the villagers like an invisible mountain, crushing their spirits and plunging the entire square into a deathly, suffocating silence. After years of paying exorbitant water bills, their savings were gone. They were already struggling to find money for basic necessities like pesticides and fertilizers, often owing debts to the local shops. They couldn't gather 5,000, let alone 50, even if they sold everything they owned. To be honest, it was an impossible demand. Uncle Ian asked if this was a repair or an execution, reminding Mr. Wallace that the contract promised something very different. He pointed out that the company representative, Mark, had personally assured them of reliable after-sales service and guaranteed they would repair any equipment that broke. Several villagers turned their eyes toward Mark, who was beginning to panic himself, as his own fruit orchard was the largest in the valley and at the greatest risk. We see the tension rising as the reality of their situation sets in. They were trapped by a system designed to fail them. The cooperative's promise of a modern solution for the countryside had turned into a nightmare for the farmers. It wasn't supposed to go this way, but the corporate machinery had already been set in motion. The villagers realized that these large firms were more interested in their bottom line than the survival of the crops. As the sun beat down on the dry earth, the weight of the state's regulations felt heavier than ever. And there they stood, holding nothing but empty promises and the fading hope of a harvest. To secure a $100,000 commission from the company, their dear friend Mark had made a fateful choice. He had voluntarily offered himself as the joint guarantor for the entire village's contract. Furthermore, he signed a dual-clause agreement where Section 7, Subsection 3, stated the terms quite clearly. If the community caused damage through illegal operation and failed to pay the compensation, the company had the legal right to claim the full amount directly from the guarantor, Mark. Upon hearing this, hundreds of eyes, previously filled with despair, suddenly locked onto Mark. Mark's face turned as pale as a sheet of paper as the weight of those stares hit him. He began to tremble uncontrollably. Back then, he had only cared about getting that cash. He wanted that money to build his house, so he hadn't even bothered to read the fine print. He had happily left his thumbprint on the page, but now he stammered that they were lying. He claimed it was just a promotion fee and that he didn't understand what a joint guarantor was. The manager simply asked if he was serious, noting it was all written there in black and white. With his fingerprint right there, he was told he could explain his lack of understanding to a judge. The company gave them exactly 3 days to scrape together the $50,000. If the money didn't appear in 3 days, a lawsuit and a court seizure order would follow. Those documents would be delivered directly into Mark's hands without a moment's delay. The threat was clear. If the funds weren't ready in 3 days, the legal department would strike. The court seizure order would arrive right on time for Mark to deal with the consequences. Mr. Wallace left, leaving behind hundreds of furious villagers who quickly surrounded Mark. Mark found himself trapped at his own front door, facing the town's insults for a full day and night. Inside the home of his uncle, Isaac, a new building had only recently been completed. It was a 2-story, red brick house in a foreign style, but the villagers were now reducing it to rubble. They lit a bonfire right in front of the door and began shouting the most brutal threats imaginable. They warned Isaac that if he didn't hand over the $50,000 to fix the water pump within 3 days, and if he allowed the entire village's fruit trees to wither away from a lack of water, they would start by burning his house to the ground. His son, Ian, was completely cornered. He didn't even dare to peek out from the second-story window. To be honest, who could blame him? He told his father they couldn't wait any longer, fearing the mob would actually beat them to death. The village was bone dry, but we learned that Ethan's land still had plenty of water. Ian had heard from the vegetable traders that on the wasteland Ethan had leased, he had successfully built a thriving ecological farm. He suggested they call Ethan to come back and resolve this emergency, which would conveniently save them from paying that $50,000 debt. Isaac agreed immediately, telling his son to call Ethan because, after all, he was the boy's uncle. He told himself that blood ties were stronger than anything else in this world. He was certain Ethan wouldn't just stand by and let his own uncle be harassed to death. Meanwhile, at the very top of the most luxurious hotel in the city center, Ethan was standing under a shimmering crystal chandelier, dressed in a high-end, custom-tailored suit. The hotel was hosting a high-level forum focused on the integration and development of modern agriculture and the provincial supply chain. It was a very prestigious event, naturally. As the head of a model company backed by the city, Ethan had just signed a major annual supply agreement. It was an exclusive deal worth $30 million with the largest fresh produce supermarket chain in the entire country. We see him holding a glass of champagne, chatting with the group's CEO. At that moment, his personal phone began to vibrate in his pocket, still holding his glass. He turned away and stepped into the quiet VIP lounge just outside the banquet hall. He pressed the answer button and calmly asked what was going on. On the other end, Ian panicked, shouting that a massive catastrophe had struck the village. The water pump belonging to the Lu Yuan company had apparently exploded. They had been without water for 2 days, and every fruit tree in the village was about to die. The neighbors were now blocking the door to their house, and things were getting ugly. He begged Ethan to return quickly with his old electric motor to save the day. Ian promised that if he just came back and pumped the water, everything from the past would be forgotten. He even told Ethan he could set whatever price he wanted for the water. Then Isaac took the phone, pleading as his uncle and admitting he had been wrong. He claimed he had been blinded by greed and deceived by that evil company. Yes, quite convenient. He told Ethan he couldn't possibly refuse to help people who were essentially dying. He reminded him of their blood bond, fearing the mob would bury him alive if Ethan didn't return. Ethan listened, wondering if Isaac and Ian had simply grown old and senile. Their memories seemed worse than a dog's. He reminded them of the day he left the village. He brought up that document, the voluntary waiver of liability and the division of assets. He asked them quite pointedly, who was the one who took the lead in signing it with a red thumbprint. He reminded them how they had accused him of corruption and of earning dirty money. For the sake of a measly commission, they hadn't hesitated to throw him out like trash. And after that, they had gone off to crawl at the feet of that investment firm. When he left, everything had been written down in black and white, quite clearly. From that moment on, the village water supply had absolutely nothing to do with Ethan. Ian pleaded with him, telling him he couldn't possibly be this heartless. He asked if Ethan could really bear the responsibility for the lives of hundreds of villagers. Ethan told him not to try and blackmail him, using the neighbors' lives as a shield. When they all signed that document, not a single one of them had hesitated. He hung up without a second thought and immediately blacklisted this new number as well. We see him push the door open to the banquet hall, where the applause was thunderous. The elite of the business world were celebrating the massive deal they had just struck. Meanwhile, miles away in those barren mountains, the angry villagers had seized Isaac. They forced him to sign away his last remaining orchard and his crumbling house. It was meant to be compensation for the entire village. A desperate move, to be sure. Ian told his father he had a plan. They would sneak into Ethan's farm at night. They would simply dismantle that old motor and reinstall it themselves. By morning, when the water was flowing again, no one would dream of blaming them. He even suggested the villagers might thank them for saving everyone's lives. This absurd theory gave Isaac a ridiculous spark of hope in the midst of his despair. Trembling, Isaac pulled the last few $1,000s from his pocket and shoved them into Ian's hands. He told Ian to wait until the early hours when everyone was asleep, then slip out through the back window. He was to go to town, find some muscle, and bring that motor back no matter what it took. At 2 in the morning, Ian set out, and later that day, he paid a small fortune to hire 2 local drifters. These were men who usually spent their days doing nothing, and they arrived in a battered old van. Soon, they were approaching the outskirts of Ethan's eco-farm, located on the western edge of the valley. In Ian's imagination, the farm was likely nothing more than a simple barbed wire fence. He pictured a straw hut where they could just snip the wire, lift the motor, and toss it in the truck. It would be completely unnoticed, or so he thought, having no idea what they were actually up against. This was no longer a traditional orchard, but a high-tech agricultural enterprise worth millions of dollars. Ian gripped a pair of heavy-duty hydraulic shears, ready to make his move. With a sharp snap, he cut through the protective perimeter fence on the outermost edge of the farm. Then, flanked by the 2 drifters, he headed straight for the climate-controlled pump house. It sat right in the center of the farm. He urged them to move quickly, pointing toward the equipment. He claimed he recognized the base of that old motor immediately. To be honest, he was probably guessing. He ordered them to unscrew the mounting bolts and haul it out. But just as one of the men fit his wrench, clamping it onto the bolt of the motor, something shifted across the entire farm's horizon. Suddenly, 16 high-intensity security floodlights roared to life all at once, drowning the area in a white light so piercingly bright that it looked like high noon. The blinding glare was so sudden that Ian and his accomplices cried out in genuine pain. Immediately after, the highest-level security alarm tore through the silence of the night. The sound was so deafening that Ian and the others couldn't even react to the blinding light. More than a dozen security guards rushed toward the farm's perimeter, their gear gleaming under the floods. These were true professionals in black uniforms, and they quickly surrounded the intruders from all sides. They were ordered to stay still. Ian, terrified, felt as though his very soul was leaving his body. His legs gave way, and he collapsed onto his knees in the mud and water-soaked grass. Barely 15 minutes later, the police arrived to take Ian into custody. Before they left, Ethan, dressed in formal loungewear, made an appearance. Accompanied by his secretary and the head of security, he walked slowly out of the office building. When Ian saw him, he looked like a drowning man desperately reaching for a final straw. Deep down, he was miserable to be caught in this state by his own brother. It seemed his desperate prophecy of success had failed him completely. Whatever gamble he had made, his time had clearly run out. Ethan simply looked at him and offered a calm greeting. He then handed over a file containing the full details of their little midnight raid. It included multi-angle surveillance footage and a formal asset evaluation report of the equipment. The high-voltage pulse motor they tried to dismantle was no ordinary piece of farm equipment. It was a core power component developed independently by the company and fully patented. The appraised book value of this specific system was over $60,000. These men had destroyed security installations and brought professional tools to commit their crime. This was a textbook case of group robbery and forced dismantling, a clear-cut instance of breaking and entering. Furthermore, since the target was a core asset of the company, the stakes were much higher than they realized. Once dismantled, thousands of our crops would have faced the immediate risk of drought and death. We are talking about potential economic losses reaching into the millions. This wasn't just a simple public order issue, but a serious criminal offense under extremely heinous circumstances. The impact of their actions, to be perfectly honest, was nothing short of catastrophic. They had actively tried to sabotage the company's operations, and Ethan made it clear that any excuses could wait. They could explain themselves later to the authorities. For now, they were being moved out. Ian screamed that Ethan was ruthless and would eventually suffer the consequences of his cold heart. The news that Ian had been criminally detained reached the village by the very next morning. For his father, Uncle Manny, who was already on the verge of a total collapse, this news hit him like a sudden, devastating bolt of lightning from a clear blue sky. Desperate to raise money for a lawyer to get his son out of jail, and facing mounting debts from both the villagers and the company, he took a drastic step. He began harvesting every single apple on the mountain, even though they weren't even close to being ripe. Imagine a harvest so sour and bitter that even the birds wouldn't consider eating it. He forced these defective products into crates, eventually filling 3 large trucks to the brim. He intended to take that literal garbage to the city's largest wholesale market to try his luck. In his limited understanding, he figured that since the city was so crowded, as long as the price was low enough, there would always be some greedy retailer willing to buy. He was sure someone would take them, but he didn't realize that times had changed and the world had moved on. He also didn't know that the wholesale market's primary supplier was no longer a faceless corporation. It was Ethan, the very man he had once driven out of the village. That morning, the city's central fresh produce market was buzzing with its usual frantic energy. With his head bowed and looking utterly defeated, Uncle Manny stood in the center of the hall, pleading humbly. He was desperately clutching the sleeve of a supermarket purchasing manager dressed in a sharp suit. He begged Manager Lewis to have mercy and just buy the fruit, calling him a big boss. He claimed they were all natural hillside apples, even if the drought had affected them this year. They were a bit small, he admitted, but the price was undeniably cheap. He wasn't even following market rates, offering them for 30 cents a kilo, no, even less. He offered them for 20 cents a kilo, telling the man to name any price or just take the trucks away. The manager told the old man he was in the wrong place, as this was the highest quality market in the province. He asked how he dared to treat this place like a landfill by bringing in such substandard goods. He scoffed that these were defective products that even pigs wouldn't consider eating. If they put such fruit on the shelves of their supermarket chain, their reputation would be ruined. The manager worried about their prestige, while nearby street vendors and truck drivers began to take notice. They stopped what they were doing and burst into laughter, pointing fingers at the desperate old man. One of them shouted that the old man must be crazy for money to even try such a thing. They mocked him, asking if he even bothered to check what kind of merchandise the market accepted these days. They told him to open his eyes and see the high standards that the modern high-end market now demanded. Uncle Manny slowly lifted his head, following the direction of Manager Lewis's pointing finger. There, on a massive screen, a high-end corporate promotional video was playing on a loop. The footage showed a fully automated sprinkler system creating shimmering rainbows under the bright sun. Integrated water and fertilizer pipes were shown precisely moisturizing every single inch of the rich soil. We see clusters of plump, perfectly round grapes that looked almost too good to be real. Under the high-definition lens, they radiated a mouth-watering vitality that captured everyone's attention. And as the video reached its conclusion, shimmering golden letters appeared across the screen. They introduced the founder of the Tianyin Agricultural Technology Group, Ethan. Uncle Manny began to tremble, his legs feeling suddenly weak as the realization hit him. The manager pointed out that the organic fruits from Ethan's company were the only ones truly in demand. Even before they are harvested, major wholesalers have already paid a premium to secure them. He scoffed that no one would want Manny's 3 trucks of junk, even if the shipping were free. Manager Lewis waved his hand dismissively, as if he were shooing away a bothersome fly. But as he turned to leave, his expression shifted instantly into one of extreme respect and flattery. He hurried toward the upper level of the Great Hall, where a ring-shaped glass corridor hung suspended. This transparent walkway led directly to the heart of the market's operations. That was where the market's administrative offices were located, far above the frantic trade floor. It housed an exclusive VIP negotiation suite reserved only for the most prestigious clients. Uncle Manny watched in a daze as Manager Lewis ran toward the suite's entrance, his eyes fixed on the massive, soundproof glass windows of the VIP room, searching for a face. He saw several high-level executives in suits gathered around a long, polished mahogany table. And sitting in the head chair, we see Ethan himself, looking down through the noisy, bustling crowd of the trading floor. It was in that moment that Uncle Manny's desperate gaze finally met Ethan's. Ethan didn't give him the smug smile of a victor, which almost would have been kinder. He didn't even look at him with anger. Instead, he simply offered a sideways glance that was unnervingly calm. It was the kind of look one might give an insignificant speck of dust on the side of the road. Uncle Manny's lips began to tremble violently as the weight of his situation finally crushed him. Suddenly, he clutched his chest with both hands and let out a heart-wrenching, desperate howl. His eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed directly onto the massive pile of his own fruit. He landed among the rotten apples, which were already giving off a sour, rancid stench of failure. As it turned out, the shock was too much, and Uncle Manny suffered a paralyzing stroke right then and there. By the time the legal team from the Albion Group arrived, he was still bedridden in his dilapidated old house. Manager Wayne returned as well, bringing a collection team and a stack of official court summons. Once again, they blocked the entrance to the village, though this time the atmosphere was far more grim. They had already dug up the irrigation pipes to settle part of the debt, but that was only the beginning. To be honest, that barely scratched the surface of the so-called $500,000 fine they were demanding. This time, Manager Wayne truly showed the greediest claws of corporate interest. He produced a thick stack of land transfer mortgage agreements, intending to force the entire village to sign them. If they couldn't pay the debt in cash, they would have to pay with the rights to their fruit orchards. Once they signed, these hundreds of hectares of land would belong entirely to the Albion Group. They were given a choice: leave the village forever or stay and work as day laborers for the company. The hundreds of villagers stood there, their faces as pale as ash, as the reality of the situation set in. We see the elders sitting on the dusty ground, unable to do anything but sob quietly. To these people, losing their land was the same as losing their very reason for existing. Auntie Wendy clutched her land deed to her chest, protecting it with a desperate, trembling grip. She wept inconsolably, pleading with the village chief that they simply could not sign those papers. If they signed, she argued, they would all become nothing more than homeless beggars. They refused to sign, even if it meant risking their lives. After all, what else did they have left? Finally, the neighbors decided their only hope was to head to the city and plead with Ethan. In their eyes, he was now the only person in the entire world who could possibly save them. When faced with absolute despair, pride and dignity quickly lose their value. A few dozen representatives pooled together the last of their meager savings to afford the trip. They rented 2 rickety, open-top trucks that looked like they might fall apart at any moment. And so, after 3 long hours of rattling through the biting autumn wind, they arrived at the gates of the Albion Agricultural Group on the outskirts of the city. They called out for Ethan, begging for the man they once knew to come out and face them. When the secretary saw this desperate scene unfolding on the security monitors, she was stunned. She went to inform Ethan, who was in the boardroom reviewing the provincial agricultural weather reports. He walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked down at the villagers lined up below. They were kneeling on the harsh asphalt outside the main gate, pressing their foreheads against the cold ground. Their initial greed had been utterly shattered by the harsh lessons of reality. Ethan put on his overcoat and, accompanied by the legal director and several security guards, he pushed through the imposing electric gates and stepped outside. Upon seeing him, the village chief stood up, his face drenched in tears. He cried out that they knew they had been wrong, calling Ethan by his childhood name. He cursed the man who had betrayed them and that heartless company. They had been deceived into ruin, and now they were on the verge of losing their land. He begged Ethan to find it in his heart to save the village, promising they would work like animals for him, so long as they could keep their land. Ethan looked at the village chief and spoke calmly. He reminded them of the day they used red ink to sign him away and what he had told them then. Life and death, giving and taking. Everyone is ultimately the master of their own destiny. Because they had been so hungry for those cheap, false advantages, they had easily handed over the village's entire reason for being to a group of swindlers. They hadn't just trampled on his hard work, they had trampled on their own safety net. By all rights, this was a bitter fruit they should have been forced to swallow themselves. But Ethan knew that his own ancestors were buried in that very soil. His father was there, and while he could choose to disown his treacherous relatives, he couldn't simply stand by and watch the village where he was born and raised be devoured to the bone by corporate vultures posing as tech innovators. The chief asked with a glimmer of hope if Ethan was truly willing to take care of them. He made it clear he wasn't running a charity. He was a businessman, first and foremost. If they wanted his help, from that moment on, every single rule in the village would be his to make. He turned to his team and told Mr. Miller to alert the fleet immediately. They were to bring every piece of evidence and follow him back to the village. He wanted to see, once and for all, who would dare touch the land beneath Ethan's feet. An hour later, 5 black commercial vans appeared on the horizon. With an overwhelming and undeniable presence, they roared into the village committee courtyard, completely blocking in the collection fleet belonging to the predatory manager Wallace. The doors slid open, and Ethan stepped out of the car looking impeccable in a tailored suit. Behind him stood 2 elite lawyers, looking every bit as sharp and formidable as their employer. Manager Wallace was baffled at first, but then he recognized the man standing before him. It was the province's rising star in the agricultural sector. His expression shifted instantly, though he still approached, desperately trying to maintain a facade of calm. He greeted him with forced cheer, acknowledging the great CEO of the Titan Group. He asked if Ethan had returned home in glory, but reminded him that today was for debt collection. He questioned if Ethan intended to interfere with what he called a normal, legal judicial proceeding. Ethan simply repeated the words, debt collection, with a cold, knowing smile. He asked Mr. Miller to read the findings aloud, so everyone could hear the truth. According to the Provincial Quality and Technology Supervision Bureau, the smart pumps sold to the village contained internal motors that were actually nothing more than refurbished industrial scrap metal. The power ratings were falsified by up to 300%, and the equipment lacked any mandatory state safety certifications. It was, in every sense of the word, a completely defective and low-quality product. Manager Wallace shouted that they were lying and pointed to the contract, but Ethan only offered a cold smile. He pointed out that the company had used these defective products to engage in blatant, deceptive advertising. Furthermore, they had forced contracts with hidden clauses and added illegal charges under the table, all of which pointed towards serious acts of commercial fraud. To be honest, they weren't even trying to hide it. Our story takes a turn as Ethan reveals the Titan Group had already officially represented the villagers to file a formal complaint with the Municipal Police Economic Investigation Brigade. The legal director standing behind Ethan stepped forward, asking to add one final, crucial detail. He made it clear that his team of elite lawyers intended to pursue this case to the very end. They wouldn't stop until they stripped the company bare and ensured their legal representative ended up working a sewing machine in a prison cell, which, naturally, was exactly where he belonged. Ethan then gave the final order. They were to take their people and get out of his village immediately. Manager Wallace looked at the formidable wall of lawyers standing in formation behind Ethan. He watched the villagers, who had found their courage and were now clenching their fists once more, realizing that this time, he had run headfirst into a very real, very solid wall. He didn't dare utter another word and, along with his collection team, fled the village in total disgrace. Suddenly, the entire courtyard of the village committee erupted into thunderous shouts and cheers. We see countless villagers bowing deeply toward Ethan, their faces filled with relief. This time, the gratitude shining in their eyes was pure, without a single hint of doubt or impurity. Driving out the Lu Yuan Company only solved the village's most urgent problem. To truly revive this land, Ethan knew they had to tear everything down and start from scratch. On the following day, the engineering caravan from the Titan Group rolled into the village. They didn't just bring brand new, high-standard, large-diameter pipes. They also brought back that same old, common electric motor he had seen years ago. However, after being upgraded by the technical team at his farm, it now boasted a state-of-the-art variable frequency control system. Accompanied by the powerful roar of the old motor, water began to gush once more through the new network of pipes, finally soaking the cracked and thirsty orchards. We see the villagers standing in the fields, letting the water droplets splash against their faces, as they wept like children. But this water was no longer a free lunch. The water had arrived, but the rules of the past had to change. The days when he provided the money and effort while they enjoyed the benefits without lifting a finger were gone forever. From this day forward, the Titan Group would take total control of the village's hydraulic facilities. Water fees would be charged at the lowest market price, not a penny more. and not a penny less. At the same time, he offered them a choice. If they were willing, they could all join his ecological supply chain. He would provide free technical advice and high-quality seedlings for everyone. There was only one requirement. They had to strictly follow the standards for chemical-free cultivation. This meant avoiding all pollutants from the Titan Group's list. The private use of banned pesticides and fertilizers was absolutely forbidden. If they were capable of producing high-quality goods, the Titan Group promised to buy every single harvest in the autumn, offering a price 20% higher than the current market rate. However, anyone who tried to cheat or damage the village's reputation would be immediately expelled from the partnership and never accepted back again. There would be no more charity, only cooperation, and certainly no more blind indulgence. Only rules remained. To be honest, that was the truest form of respect and the only way to achieve lasting redemption. With trembling hands, the mayor was the first to solemnly sign the cooperation agreement. He pressed his red thumbprint onto the paper and looked at Ethan, telling him the village's entire future was now in his hands. The old man admitted they owed him everything and asked Ethan to lead the way from now on. He vowed they would all follow him, and if anyone showed a double heart again, he would personally break their legs. Hundreds of villagers formed a long, orderly line, without a single fight or a word of complaint. They understood now, no charity, only work. The mayor signed again for the official records, sealing their path forward, and they all promised to follow Ethan's lead. The mayor repeated his warning, making it clear that betrayal would be met with a very personal kind of justice. He was quite serious about the consequences for anyone who dared to harbor dishonest intentions toward their benefactor. And so, with the eventual arrival of spring, the peach and pear blossoms on the mountains began to glow like vibrant, colorful clouds. By the time autumn returned, premium fruit hung heavy from the branches, filling the air with a sweet, intoxicating scent. Thanks to the high-end, temperature-controlled logistics chain provided by the Titan Group, the village's fruit arrived directly at luxury supermarkets in the country's major cities. The villagers' income increased fivefold compared to the past. A welcome change, to be sure. The young people who had left to find work began returning home, one after another. Every family rebuilt their home and bought cars, and we see that the village was soon filled with laughter and joy every single day. At the village entrance stood a new landmark. The gate had been widened and renovated, looking truly imposing and majestic. In front of the modern pump house, the villagers took the initiative to raise money and erect a tall, clear stone monument. There were no superfluous words of flattery to be found. Only 8 large characters engraved there. When drinking the water, remember the source. It spoke of effort and heart. To be honest, it was a simple but powerful sentiment. This was a sense of gratitude etched into the very bones of the village. It was also the greatest sign of respect for Ethan. One early autumn afternoon, he drove his car back to the village to personally inspect the results of this year's fruit harvest. As soon as his car reached the entrance, he was surrounded by enthusiastic neighbors. Auntie Wendy insisted on stuffing a basket of freshly picked apples into his trunk, choosing only the largest and reddest. With misty eyes, she took his hand and called him director. She urged him to try them, claiming this year's fruit was exceptionally sweet. She wondered aloud how they could have ever seen such a day without his help. Ethan simply smiled as he took the apple, greeting his neighbors with a familiar warmth. He felt a deep sense of village affection that he hadn't experienced in a very long time. However, as he passed some crumbling red brick ruins at the edge of town, we see a familiar silhouette. It was his uncle, Ian. He was sitting in a rusty, broken wheelchair, looking completely disheveled and filthy. In his hands, he clutched a broken, dented bowl that was deeply sunken in. While his son remained in prison, Ian had been left paralyzed by a stroke, barely surviving, now thanks only to the monthly charity of the villagers. With a twisted mouth and cloudy eyes, he stared fixedly at the joyful, bustling scene. The man who once tried to ruin the entire village for a pittance now watched as, under Ethan's leadership, everyone moved toward a shared and lasting prosperity. He alone remained eternally isolated from this newfound happiness and wealth. It was his cruelest punishment, and to be honest, his most just one as well. Ethan didn't stop. He simply pressed the accelerator, and the car glided smoothly past. Next to those ruins, the sweet scent of mountain fruits drifted through his window. The evening breeze arrived just as the clouds finally cleared from the sky. Looking at the land full of life, his heart felt an unprecedented sense of peace. True strength, we realize, isn't about simply crushing the wicked into the mud. It is about rising above it, setting new rules, and dismantling lies with absolute power. It is about reshaping the soul of the land with a broad and generous vision. This land, heavy with fruit, had finally found its path clear at last. As for Ethan, he found himself carrying the weight of this heavy social responsibility.